What's up, guys? I hope you had a good weekend. It was the final one. I can't believe it's all over. 2018 F1 season is pretty much over, bar the test this week. Unbelievable. I thought it was a great event. Had quite a bit actually going on in the race, didn't it? Spectacular crashes, and it was reasonably close. I know that Lewis dominated it and he had it under control, but the last event is always a good one, and Abu Dhabi is, whatever you think of the place, it's a good place to hold the final Grand Prix because they put on such a big show, and that's what Formula One should be. Anyway, judging by all of your questions that you sent in, as you always do, it has provoked plenty of conversation, plenty of things to talk about, plenty of things to discuss. So thank you very much for all of those questions that have come my way. Appreciate them all. Let's get into some of them. Roll the sting! Right, let's start with this one that more than one of you asked about. And it was the first thing that I think sprung to my mind when I saw it. I'm talking about Hulkenberg's crash. So this question from Scott McClung. He says, what do you think about Hulkenberg's crash in Abu Dhabi? Do you think the halo effectively trapped him in the car? Now, I've got to say, when he was on the radio, and they broadcast it, of course, didn't they, saying, look, I'm okay, but I'm hanging upside down the seatbelts. Get me out of the car. It's on fire. Get me out of the car. Wasn't he? He was starting to panic a little bit, which indicates that he couldn't get out of the car, given the situation, the position that it was all in. Now, the halo didn't really have to do anything in terms of the accident. When the car rolled upside down, it was the overhead roll structure that kept Hulkenberg's head off the ground and kept him safe. And to be fair, that's not what the halo is designed for. The halo is designed to protect any inbound objects, stop the driver's head from coming into contact with bouncing wheels and parts of cars that might be coming across the racetrack. So rolling the car upside down is not the job, or protecting the driver in that situation is not the job of the halo. However, once the car came to rest in that situation, yes, I think there's a fair argument to say that the halo must have made it far more difficult for the driver to get out of the car than it perhaps otherwise would. However, my thoughts on this are not suddenly, right, the halo's a disastrous thing, we need to get rid of it. There are plenty of situations where a car can come to rest in an unpredictable some of these situations are so unpredictable. You can't simulate every type of crash. You can't simulate every position the car's going to come to rest in. And sometimes it might come to rest on top of a tyre barrier, on top of a tyre wall, or it could be any kind of situation on top of another car upside down. And halo or otherwise, there could well be situations where the driver is finding it very difficult to get out of the car. So I think perhaps the halo did make it more difficult on this occasion, but I don't think we need to have some knee-jerk reaction to say, right, let's get rid of the halo, it's disastrous. The important thing to note is, yes, the car did catch fire at the back of the car, but it was never a problem. The fuel tank, don't forget that car was full of fuel at the start of the race. The fuel tank was never breached. The fuel tank was never, never kind of caught fire, never became explosive. Those kind of accidents, I can't think of one for a long, long time in Formula One. And that's most people's fear, that if a driver's sat in a car that's burning, like they used to do in the olden days, and can't get out, that's one of the biggest fears. But the reality is that those kind of accidents just don't really happen anymore. And yes, they could happen. There is always a possibility. But I think, having looked at all the evidence, as the FIA have done, they've weighed up all of the risks and the rewards and deemed that the halo has more benefits than it has risks associated with it. Frankie Johnny says, why can't we see the FIA Drivers Briefing in 2018? So you're referring, I think, to the fact that back in 2017 we had a couple of opportunities to put cameras inside the FIA Drivers Briefing ahead of each Grand Prix event. Now, that was an experimental thing. on behalf of FOM. Not everybody liked it. I know from a fan's point of view it's great, but the drivers didn't like it at all, and Charlie Whiting didn't really like it either. And the reason for that is that the drivers briefing is one of the last places where the drivers and Charlie can all get together in the same room and speak freely about the kind of concerns and things they want to talk about, the concerns about on-track actions, circuit characteristics, safety elements, those kind of things they can speak openly and freely about. As soon as you put a camera in there, you know, with the best will of the world, everybody starts thinking about their appearance. They start thinking about how they come across, and it becomes an entertainment feature, and that's not what that part of the race weekend is about. It's a very serious and important part of the race weekend, and personally, although I did enjoy watching them, I actually think it's the right decision to not have cameras in that particular meeting. David Cook says, hi Mark, I noticed that Mercedes and perhaps some others have a small Sawtooth windscreen on the front of the car. Is that for aerodynamics or ventilation, or ventilation for the driver? The dogs have just come straight in the water, absolutely soaked. Brilliant. So, David, the reason for the Sawtooth windscreen, it is aerodynamics. Of course it's aerodynamics. It's actually to do with a sort of buffeting around the driver's head. And what that means is that when the driver, because the driver's head is the only part sticking out above the top of the cockpit, it's not protected, if you like, by the aerodynamic surfaces of the car. It's the only part of the driver that isn't really. And so that means that you can get buffeting, i.e. the driver's head can start to get, you know, you sometimes driving along in your road car and you open up one of the windows a little bit and you start to get that real horrible pulsating wind noise coming in. Well, that's a kind of buffeting effect where the wind pulses through the open gap. That sort of thing can happen to a driver's head, and it can be incredibly uncomfortable and actually pretty destabilising for the driver, and also not very aerodynamic if the driver's head is being shaken around all over the place. So they put the little windscreen on there. Now, most people have always, and traditionally, have always used just a small windscreen to act a little bit like a gurney, which just trips the airflow up, tips it over the driver's head. What Mercedes have found is by using that little sawtooth gurney, and it's the same reason that some people use it on the rear wing, you may have seen that before, it just creates lots of little spinning vortices coming off those little triangle shaped sawtooth parts of that screen, and those vortices tend to work better around the driver's crash helmet, or certainly around Lewis's crash helmet. The reason you don't see everybody doing it is it's very much a driver preference thing, and the team will work with the driver and the driver's helmet manufacturer to create the best solution for that particular helmet, for his seating position. It also helps control the airflow into the overhead airbox above the driver's head as well. So there are lots of considerations, and only by putting those things into a wind tunnel or modelling them on CFD can you get, you know, we're talking about tiny details, but only by doing that can you really find out which one works best for each particular driver, crash helmet, car situation. James Baldwin says, Mark, during Q2 the top teams tend to go out on the quali tyre to condition them for the race. What does this do? Why is it better than using a brand new tyre? I'm not sure people are going out in Q2 to condition tyres. They tend to use both types of tyre, sometimes just to get a banker lap in on perhaps the fastest tyre, and then if they want to start the race on the other tyre, then they'll go out and try and set their proper timed lap on that tyre to give them the best race strategy. However, having said all of that, there are occasions when teams will find an advantage in conditioning a tyre, and by that what we mean is putting it through the heat cycle of using it on a car. And that means that when a car goes out on a set of tyres, they go out having been in blankets, of course. They're set at the desired temperature in a blanket, but all the blanket can do is heat up the surface of the tyre. And obviously there is temperature that soaks through, but the tyre blankets mainly heat up the surface. When that tyre goes out on the car and is put through its paces of a proper lap, the tyre temperature of the surface, of course, goes up even further, but also temperature from the brakes is transferred through to heat up the carcass of the tyre, the main body of the tyre. And that really is what needs to happen to bring that tyre into its proper working range. But when that does happen, when the whole thing gets cooked up to its proper temperature, which can be pretty high at times, you imagine going through some of the long duration fast corners, the loading on those tyres is pretty extreme. The temperature during those periods of time reaches massive numbers, way higher than they were ever subject to when they were in tyre blankets in the garage. And that process has a kind of curing effect. Because the tyres are made of a sort of chemical compound of rubber, temperature has a huge effect on how the chemical properties of that compound behave. So when you put it through its paces, when you put it through all of its extreme temperatures that it sees, it actually changes the compound and the characteristics ever so slightly of that particular tyre. Now that means that once it's been through that conditioning process, if you want to call it that, that curing process, the tyre behaves slightly differently. So the engineers sometimes will want to condition a tyre, put it through that process, go through the extreme heating and cooling process that it does on a Formula 1 lap, so they then know that when it goes out for real in the race, for example, that curing process has already happened. The changes in characteristics have already happened, and therefore it will be a much more stable tyre when it comes to the race. So that can happen, and it does happen. I'm just not sure it happens very much in Q2. Stephen Chan says, and this is a really interesting one, I've got some thoughts on this which may feature in another video as well, but he says, why is F1 only focusing on aero in terms of close racing? Why not change some of the corners a bit to allow multiple apex cornering? Could that not improve the racing as well? Different lines going through the corner, that kind of thing. Absolutely, it really could, Stephen. And the reason I find that so interesting is I had a really big chat with Lucas de Grassi on this very subject last year, I think it was, at a Formula E race. He's got some really strong thoughts on this, and he's a kind of an influential character now within the world of motorsport, more and more so. And I think there's people talking about him as a future FIA president, by the way, a job which I know he would love. And if he got to that point, I think absolutely this is an area that he would look at. There's a series of tweets, if I can find them I will. Those diagrams really show how multiple apex corners, where there are lots of, a number of different driving lines through the corner, can really change the game and can really give opportunities to drivers through corners. At the moment, we're all stuck to what is the fastest line around a racetrack. If we deviate off that in any way, it's slower. And that is why we have such a problem, because there's only room on that racing line for one car. As soon as you come off that racing line, you're going more slowly, and you're out of the aero slipstream and all the other problems we all know about. So yeah, I think look, interesting point, Stephen. I might come back and readdress this because I think it deserves perhaps a bit more explanation. But absolutely, I think they should be looking at that as well as the cars. The problem, of course, with doing that is that to change 21 racetracks is obviously a huge operation, whereas to change 20 racing cars that are being redesigned every single year anyway is not such a big drama. So logistically, it's obviously far more difficult to do it that way around. Now, this question comes from Jack. Jack says, as teams are allowed to do 100 kilometres of mileage for filming days, who keeps track of that? Is an FIA person do it, or is it the team's technical manager? It's a good point. They are allowed to do 100 k's of filming, and actually the way that it's policed is digitally. So the teams have to run at all times, and every time that the car is switched on, everything is being logged through a sealed FIA data logger. This is a standard component that every team runs. It's actually made by McLaren. So every time a car is even switched on or the engine's fired up, the data from that is logged, and it can't be fired up without that piece, in the car and connected. So that is basically how they do it. So every time a car goes anywhere or turns a wheel or does anything, the data is all there. And at every time, every opportunity that the FIA want to, and certainly at every race meeting, that data logger is downloaded, the data from it downloaded, checked, reset. So anything like that would be known about. The other thing is that, as I said this once before, it's very, very difficult to run a Formula One car in secret. People have often asked me, what's stopping a team like Ferrari, for example, who has their own test track, just going out testing whenever they want? Well, it's very, very difficult to run a Formula One car without the world knowing about it. They're incredibly loud, they're incredibly well known, and in the modern world of phones and Twitter and Instagram and all the rest of it, I don't think you get very far without somebody posting pictures and footage of it online. But yeah, so there you go. It's monitored by the FIA. The FIA can also, and often do, assign somebody to go to those filming days, to be there in person as well. So if the FIA want to send somebody along, they can absolutely do that, and that does happen. Stefan78 says, did you see the press conference? What needs to be changed to get this kind of vibe every time? Perhaps a different format? Well, look, the press conferences, for me, are the dullest part of a Formula One weekend. Certainly as a TV spectacle, they're awful. I know that everybody within the TV world thinks that they're a horrible event to just go and film. The fact is that all the journalists that are in the press conference kind of ask questions that they're not really the interesting questions, because they all know that they're all going to get their own kind of private sessions with those drivers at some point over the weekend, and that's where they want to ask their own interesting questions, because they don't want the whole world getting the access and the answers to their questions. They want to keep that exclusive for their newspaper or for their channel or whatever it might be. So that's one of the reasons the questions are often so inanely boring. The fact that yesterday's was very different, it kind of comes down to the fact that it was the last race of the season, doesn't it? It was a last day of school syndrome. Everyone's very relaxed, very jovial, very different to the way that you would be in the heat of battle during a high pressure season. So I don't know what the answer is. I talked about ideas in the past where fans can get to ask the questions in the press conference, where they have no real agenda, certainly no media agenda that the journalists have in that sense. So let's get questions sent in, let's maybe even do it live. Let's get fans on the line asking questions. I know that turns into more of an entertainment spectacle, but isn't that what it's all about? Anyway, I mean, if you've got ideas of how to make the press conference more interesting, please do let me know. I'd be really interested to know, how you would go about doing that. Because it's nice to hear from a select few drivers on their own in the wider press world that's circulated amongst everybody. And it would be great to have that on TV as it is. But its current format is dull, it's restrictive, it's not interesting. Or certainly it could be a lot more interesting. Let's put it that way. So if you were in charge, how would you do it?